Good morning, everyone. I'm Lola Adeshoye, and I am here at the World Bank with David Wilson. David Wilson is the AIDS Programme Director for the World Bank, and today, on World AIDS Day, we're going to be talking about AIDS in Africa. So, David, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
So, if you could tell our viewers a bit more about who you are and what it is you do here at the World Bank.
Well, as you said, I'm the director of the World Bank AIDS Programme, and we work with each of our regions, and particularly the Africa region, to support countries with their AIDS programs.
Fantastic. And so today, World AIDS Day, why is this day so important?
Well, World AIDS Day has historically commemorated the severity of the challenge of AIDS, and it's also an occasion to celebrate successes. And in the last year, as we'll discuss, we have had some important achievements and breakthroughs.
Fantastic. So let's get into that a bit. It's been nearly 3 years since the AIDS epidemic began. Has the world yet turned the corner on HIV and AIDS?
It's a good question, and it does depend partly how you look at it. On the one hand, we have over 32 million people worldwide living with HIV, and 2/3 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. However, in the last 3 years, we've seen HIV rates drop by 25% or more in about 26 countries worldwide, including 22 countries in Africa. So the problem remains severe, but we are starting to see some encouraging signs that HIV may be slowing or declining.
Wow. So what is it that's contributed to those drops?
I think that so far the biggest changes that have contributed to the drops have been in behavior. People have adopted safer sexual behaviors. In particular, they've reduced their numbers of partners. They may choose partners whose ages are closer to their own, and I'm sure we'll discuss that later. And they've increased their use of condoms. We also have evidence that other methods are promising or effective. For example, we know that male circumcision reduces HIV by 50 to 70%, and there's now a big increase in demand for safe male circumcision in Eastern and Southern Africa. We also know that antiretroviral drugs can help to reduce the transmission of HIV from mothers to their babies, and we believe that antiretroviral microbicides are also effective in reducing transmission and give women a female-controlled method to use. And we also know now that taking antiretroviral drugs prior to risky sex can substantially reduce one's likelihood of transmitting AIDS. So we've seen behavior change, and we have an increasing number of proven new methods we can use.
So it seems like there's quite a lot there. So I just want to talk about a few things that I heard.
Sure.
So you talked about East Africa and Southern Africa with male circumcision.
Yes.
Are you seeing that in some countries the rates are decreasing faster than in other countries?
Yes. Historically, we've seen that 2 countries tackled and reduced HIV perhaps a decade before any other. One was in Africa, Uganda, and the other was in Asia, Thailand. And they did it in very different epidemic contexts. But in Uganda, in the 1980s, very decisive political leadership, very strong community engagement, and a willingness to be open and confront the disease reduced HIV by approximately half in Uganda. We subsequently saw similar declines in Kenya and Zimbabwe. And we now have the wider declines among young people in the 22 countries I cited.
And is there any country that is particularly challenging, or one that you really, is one that, the World Bank would like to focus on?
I think that there are countries that are challenging, and their governments and the international community, including the World Bank, do need to focus on. It's quite striking that almost 30% of all of HIV globally is concentrated in just 2 countries. South Africa with 17% of global infections, and Nigeria with 13%. So these 2 countries alone are home to 1 in 3 people worldwide with HIV, and they're clearly a critical priority.
Thank you. And so if you can tell me more about the role that the World Bank has played in the fight against HIV/AIDS in the world, so we can let our viewers know.
Yes, with pleasure. The World Bank was one of the first international funders to focus on programs for sexually transmitted infections, sexual health, and HIV in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, we're very proud that the World Bank launched the first multi-billion-dollar AIDS program, the multi-country AIDS programs, or MAPs, in Africa, and these really helped to transform the global landscape and to catalyze what was $1 million response into $1 billion response. So we think that's been an important achievement, and the MAP has operated in over 30 countries in Africa and has really helped to strengthen the community response to AIDS.
So the World Bank really was a pioneer in AIDS, HIV/AIDS financing.
We were, and now others have taken up the challenge, and for example, the PEPFAR, the US President's Initiative, is by far the largest donor with $61 billion, primarily for AIDS, but also other important diseases. And the Global Fund has a replenishment of $10.3 billion. So the funding landscape is now much larger, but I think we helped to galvanize that change.
So there are people that you're working with, partners. Who are these partners that you're working with, and what strengths do they bring to the table?
The World Bank's principal partner are national governments. But we also try to work closely and consult closely with civil society, with academic institutions and other partners.
So talking of civil society, what is the interaction that you might have as the World Bank with civil society?
Sure. Much of our interaction is mediated through national governments, but in the MAPs, for example, we did our best to ensure that at least 50% of the grant or loan money in each case was allocated to civil society. And we funded thousands and thousands of civil society organizations in Africa to deliver grassroots services.
Because you did talk about behaviour as well, and I see that the correlation between civil society and behaviour is obviously, is the people and the behaviour that matters. Is that an area that you think deserves even more attention than it's already getting?
That's an excellent question. I think, in complete honesty, there is some skepticism in scientific communities about the extent to which it's possible to cause behavior change from the outside. And so we've seen a focus on biomedical interventions, male circumcision, the use of antiretroviral drugs, not only for treatment but for prevention. And I think it is important to persist with behavior change. The difficulty is, we know that people change their behavior in response to HIV. It's not always possible to attribute those changes to formal programs, whether World Bank or otherwise. So we need to understand better how to effect change. And it's quite striking that the first country in Africa to decisively change behavior, Uganda, did so on its own, largely without international assistance, largely without international financing, before AIDS was really recognized as an international development priority. So I don't think that outside financing is a substitute for domestic political commitment.
Thank you. Actually, a couple of things before we continue that I noticed that I think people would like to have clarified.
Sure.
Number one, what is the difference between HIV and AIDS?
Well, HIV is the virus which ultimately develops into the syndrome of diseases known as AIDS, and AIDS is the cluster of diseases that results from acquiring HIV. But it's no longer automatic that people will acquire HIV and progress to AIDS, because we have increasingly effective treatments. And it's striking that over 5 million people worldwide, many of them in Africa, are now receiving antiretroviral treatment. And in the last 3 years, treatment coverage has gone up 13-fold. It's very difficult to think of any other development initiative that's expanded 13-fold in just 3 years.
So antiretroviral drugs have been mentioned a couple of times. If you could just tell me a bit more about what they are, how they work, and their importance.
Sure. Antiretroviral drugs are drugs which slow down the progression of retroviruses, of which HIV is one. And we've learned in the last 2 decades that giving people a combination of antiretroviral drugs can reduce the progression from HIV to AIDS. And as I said, 5 million people in Africa are now receiving those drugs. And we know that they result in much longer life expectancy, a return to health, a return to productivity, a return to roles as parents, as breadwinners.
And another, I think, very important question is the World Bank. What is the World Bank?
Yeah, the title is misleading. Often when I'm traveling and people ask me who I work for and I say the World Bank, they think of a commercial bank. We're not a commercial bank, we're a development bank. What we do is we provide loans or grants to governments primarily to initiate development projects, historically in infrastructure, road building, bridge building, dam building, but increasingly in human development, in education, in health, in what we call social protection, which is safety nets for people who encounter difficulty.
Thank you for clarifying that. So as we talked about the difference between HIV and AIDS, so where is the focus really? Is it on both, you know, in sync, or is it more on the HIV?
It's an excellent question. It needs to be both. I think in the last decade there's increasing agreement that because of the great potential for treatment and the focus on treatment and our ability to put, as I said, 5 million people on treatment, our focus became on treatment. But I think we recognize now that without effective prevention, treatment won't be sustainable. And the reality is, even though 5 million people are on treatment, for every person newly placed on treatment, 2 more become newly infected with HIV. So we really need to redouble our focus on prevention so that we don't face an endless increase in the number of people needing treatment.
Yes, most definitely. So, I mean, even with the encouraging news that HIV infections are slowing down, the challenge of keeping young people, in particular HIV-free, is huge. So how do we keep young people safe so that they can stay in school, learn new skills?
It's a great point. I think while it's very important to keep young people HIV-free, it's also important to recognize that in many African countries, the majority of infections, over half of them, are actually in people aged 30 and older. So both older people and younger people are vulnerable, and we don't actually have as good set of programs for older people as young people. So we need both. But turning specifically to your question about young people, there's a recently presented World Bank study that is relevant. Colleagues of ours worked in Zomba in southern Malawi to look at the effects of giving cash transfers, small grants to families to keep young girls initially in school. And they found that giving modest grants in the order of $20 3 times a year reduced HIV prevalence by about 50% among young women, whether they stayed in school or not. And in relation to our earlier discussion about behavior change, what seems to have happened is that younger women who received these modest cash transfers had more ability to choose their partners carefully. So they appeared to choose younger partners whose ages were closer to their own. And that's important because younger partners are less likely to be infected. So we think that cash transfers can be a good means of keeping girls in school, allowing them to complete their education, and also allowing them to remain healthy.
Because, I mean, what would you say really is the impact on Africa as a continent of having such a high HIV rate?
I think that just to illustrate the extent of the problem, consider Southern Africa. In Botswana, for example, which is Africa's most successful economy, in Francistown, the second largest city in Botswana, in northern Botswana, among young women aged 30 to 35, almost 70% are HIV infected. And that's an extraordinary burden. And I think we would have seen an immense impact had it not been for successful treatment. In Swaziland, another small southern African country, almost 50% of women aged 20 to 30 are HIV positive. And had it not been for treatment, we can only envisage the amount of mortality that would have resulted. In Swaziland, for example, even though we now have treatment, up to 1 in 3 children have been orphaned by AIDS. So the social and developmental impact is vast.
Thank you. Just want to take a couple of questions from our online audience.
Sure.
Number 1 is, any advanced ideas on how to deal with youth HIV?
That's an excellent question. We touched on that a little bit.
Yes.
I think that it's a great challenge because young people, particularly young girls, are very vulnerable to HIV infection. And as I said, what makes them particularly vulnerable is the fact that for economic and other reasons, they sometimes have older sexual partners whose risks of having HIV are much higher. We have seen, for example, that modest cash transfers to women in Malawi can help them to choose their partners more carefully, and I think that's very important indeed. I think what we also saw in Uganda, though, is that young women don't really determine the dominant sexual culture of a country. Older men determine that sexual culture, and what seems to be very important in Uganda was changing the sexual culture and behavior of older men. making it normatively unacceptable for them to have much younger partners. And that seems to have been extremely important in protecting young women.
Thank you. So there are a couple of things I want to come to about some things you said. Gender, the role of gender, women and children, well, women disproportionately affected by HIV, and you've pointed to a couple of things. Could you tell us more about the role of gender in
Sure. In fact, globally, there's only one region where women are a majority of those living with HIV, and that's Africa, where almost 60% of people living with HIV in many countries are women. Elsewhere in the world, men are a majority, and that's because HIV elsewhere is spread primarily through injecting drug use or through men having sex with men. But in Africa, women do bear a disproportionate burden, and there are many reasons for that, one of which is the greater biological susceptibility to HIV. The second of which, as I've noted, is the fact that young women often form sexual partnerships with older men. So we have been trying to develop what we call female-controlled methods that don't rely upon male consent to use. And at the International AIDS Conference in Vienna, Austria in July, there was very exciting news that an antiretroviral gel, which women can use themselves without informing their partners, significantly reduces HIV. And so we now have an increasing range of female-controlled prevention methods.
Fantastic, thank you. One more question from an online question. What is the incentive for the World Bank, a financial organisation, well, you have talked about what the World Bank is, to impact social change?
Sure. We're not primarily a financial institution, we're a development institution that provides grants and loans to achieve development outcomes. Our mission is to eradicate poverty, and it's very difficult to see how we can eradicate poverty in Africa in particular if so many people are ill with HIV and so many people require expensive treatment. So we believe that controlling HIV is really essential for the eradication of poverty in Africa.
And that clearly is the World Bank's incentive.
Yes.
So going forward, because we have the Millennium Development Goals, 2015, to basically stop HIV and AIDS. So that's a lofty goal.
Yes.
And one that we have had online audience who say they really believe that can happen in the next 5 years. So going forward, how does the World Bank plan to help Africa tackle HIV and AIDS?
Sure. The Millennium Development Goal for HIV is to halt or reverse the spread of HIV, and in fact, as the recent UNAIDS 2010 epidemic report suggests, we're now on track to at least partially achieve that goal in the countries where we've seen HIV decline significantly. And as the World Bank, we have several channels to contribute to those goals. First, we've historically been a very large financier of dedicated standalone AIDS projects. We're also a significant financier of health sector projects, which include an AIDS focus, and that will be an important lens for us. We've also got innovative financing mechanisms, such as what we call results-based financing, where finances are provided contingent upon the achievement of results, and this can be an incentive to improve service delivery, and that can be an important contribution to expanded AIDS services. We also provide research and analytic support to governments, so we do have a range of ways in which we can contribute.
Fantastic. And what are the lessons that you've learned so far?
I think that the greatest lessons we've learned are that international assistance is extremely important, but it cannot substitute for national political commitment and community engagement. I'd mentioned earlier that the most successful AIDS response in Africa, Uganda's, was largely locally driven, and it originated largely before donors were involved and largely without external money. And I do think it's important to recognize that the future of Africa's HIV epidemic is in the hands of African countries, African leaders, and African communities. They do hold the key to successful prevention. We can all contribute, but prevention, behavior change, social and cultural change begin at home.
That is a really very important point. And points to that, you know, it's not just about money,
right?
Not just about funding and financing, and that more, you know, needs to be done on the ground.
Right.
And the World Bank does impact on those things as well.
Yes.
So this leads me to a question about health systems,
yes.
Strengthening health systems. Can you explain what health systems are and what that means for HIV and AIDS?
Yes. Well, health systems are really simply the totality of a functioning health service. So it's, for example, the management systems, it's the doctors, it's the buildings, it's the maintenance of the buildings, it's the purchasing and supply of drugs, it's the quality assurance of drugs, it's the training and retraining of health personnel. It's a health service in its entirety. And I think one of the reflections of the last decade has been the focus on HIV as a developmental challenge was unprecedented, and it galvanized a unique global movement, and it raised unprecedented sums of money, and that was immensely positive. But when so much money is focused on one problem, we can neglect other disease challenges, and Africa has a multiplicity of disease challenges. We also realized that we delivered many AIDS services through parallel institutions. So instead of using the government's own health services, the government's own hospitals and clinics, we often used NGO or separate facilities. And that's not ultimately the most efficient thing to do. So what we now think we need to do is maintain a focus on AIDS, but try to strengthen the overall health sector and try to integrate health-related AIDS services into the health sector, so that when, for example, mothers are treated for HIV in order to prevent their babies developing HIV, that happens in an overall service for babies, and the whole constellation of services is provided to the child. So it's trying to integrate AIDS and health services and health resources together, so that both AIDS and health dollars work for each other, work doubly hard to be effective.
Right. So I would like to go to some of the questions we've had from Facebook.
Yeah.
To date. We had well, actually this was more of a statement really from a Bob Seth in Ghana, who said, "The battle has been well fought, but there's need to work extra hard to win the war. Success in this whole process depends on the result of the war. Kudos to the programme and its leadership under the director for this fearless fight." So that's just a comment from Bob Seth in Ghana. We have had a conversation about antiretroviral drugs, which somebody asked.
Yes.
Well, Bertrand Urama said, "AIDS is not as deadly as people are saying it is. It depends on how you manage it, and that's what makes it deadly. If you have any strange feelings and you go to have a test and you know your statutes, it's confidential." So what do you say about his comment?
I think it is clear that in the great majority of cases, if untreated, HIV does lead to AIDS and to illness and in all likelihood death. And if AIDS seems less serious than we have said, that's a tribute to the success of our treatment programs. Because I think many of us can remember the days before treatment when entire hospitals were full of emaciated, dying people whom we could offer nothing to. So I do think it's important to remind this generation that AIDS is extremely serious and that treatment may have helped to reduce its consequences, but we need to recognize its seriousness and we need to continue to focus on prevention.
So we've had another question from Facebook, a writer from Kenya.
Yes.
What can we do to fight stigma?
I would begin by saying that I think one of the many things that Africa can take pride in is how successfully it has confronted stigma. If you think that we faced a very complex and perplexing, almost invisible disease in Africa for 3 decades, that infected in many cases up to 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people in many communities, and if we reflect that 2/3 of all people worldwide living with HIV live in Africa, it's actually remarkable that there has been so little stigma and discrimination. We do have isolated incidents of stigma and discrimination, but in general, I think we have to recognize that Africa has coped with HIV with remarkably little stigma and discrimination. So that would really be my principal point here.
Great. So again with Facebook, talking about the eradication as we referred to earlier with the Millennium Development Goals. Boubacar Adamu says, "I'm sure that with awareness, we will be able to completely eradicate HIV/AIDS. Let's join forces to develop an action plan that takes into account the moral and cultural values of each society." You also referred to that. "I rely on governments, social actors, young, and all United Nations volunteers." Now, what do you say about what Boubacar said?
I think Boubacar's highlighted a very important issue, and it's also an issue I touched on earlier about which there's considerable controversy. I completely agree that we need the sorts of locally led awareness and behavior change and social and cultural change campaigns that Boubacar has referred to. I do think it's quite difficult to cause those from the outside, so it's very much a question of national responsibility. But I think I would also point out that many influential scientists are now very pessimistic that behavior change can happen, and there's an increasing focus on what we call the biomedical interventions, such as male circumcision, such as the use of antiretroviral drugs to reduce transmission without changing behavior. And so I would respond by saying that we need the initiatives that Boubacar's described. We also need better evaluation of those initiatives, so we have better evidence to inform future policy choices. Because without this evidence, there's a danger that the sorts of behavioral and cultural change programs that we've talked about may be neglected.
Yeah. And you mentioned again about antiretroviral drugs. I've seen from some statistics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that only a small number of people actually have access to them out of the wider population. So, I mean, is that correct?
Yes, it is. It also depends on the threshold at which we become eligible for treatment. And historically, that's been at what we call a CD4 level count of 200, when we're starting to get sick. But there's increasing evidence that the earlier we put people on treatment, the better their outcomes. So there's now a WHO policy recommendation based on good science to start treating people at 350 CD4 count. The difficulty is that expands the number of people who potentially need treatment. And yes, unfortunately, despite the immense successes I've described, despite 5 million people being on treatment, despite a 13-fold growth in the last 3 years, only a minority of those needing treatment still get it. There are countries that are an exception. In Southern Africa, for example, Botswana in particular, Namibia, South Africa, have large-scale successful treatment programs which reach the majority of people who need them. In East Africa, Rwanda has shown what a post-genocide country can do in just a decade. It was one of the very first countries in the world to provide universal access to antiretroviral drugs. But the challenge is still immense. And in the current financial climate, in the current constrained financial climate, we need to continue to focus on prevention so that we don't have an ever-expanding number of people needing treatment. Globally and in many countries, we were initially slow to recognize the severity of AIDS. Then I think we responded decisively, but we now face so many competing challenges. We still face the consequences of a global economic crisis. We face competing health and development challenges. And I do think that we're going to have to make better use of the knowledge and the evidence we have. And we're going to have to implement programs more efficiently and more effectively, because we won't see the same increase in AIDS funding in future that we've seen in the past. So I think the short answer is, globally, we were slow to respond. Then we responded decisively, but now we need to respond more effectively as well.
And how would you describe the more effective response?
I think the key to a more effective response is beginning with the principle we need to know our epidemics. We need to understand who's getting infected, how and where. We need to understand the drivers in each context. We need to focus our resources on the major drivers. We need to have incentives for better service delivery. We need stronger performance management. We need greater accountability at the community level, at the national level, at the international level.
And you've talked quite a fair bit about prevention and cultural change, behavioural change.
Yes.
Just from my own personal view, it seems that tackling the externals are important, but if you're not dealing with the root, then you're going to keep on expanding, and really dealing with those root causes are really crucial going forward.
I completely agree, and we've touched on some of the root causes today. Gender inequality is important, for example. In Eastern and Southern Africa, it seems likely that a culture of very high alcohol use may also exacerbate, that is, increase HIV transmission. We also need to deal with inequality. It is striking that countries with the greatest inequality appear to have the greatest HIV, and that's because we have some people with a lot of money who can afford to have a lot of partners, and many people without money who have little choice over their sexual partners, and that's something we also need to tackle. Yes.
Thank you. So, someone who's written here from Nigeria, who is positive, works with a network of people living with HIV/AIDS in Nigeria.
Yes.
And a support group in Ogun State, and basically we'd just love to know more about HIV. So is there any kind of generic information that you could give our viewers that they would find useful?
I think the best thing we could do would be to follow up individually and to provide some further information.
Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. So just generally, you know, going forward, this is clearly a massive issue, and one with very, you know, multiple strands going on, and I really
Yes.
highly commend what you're doing and what the World Bank is doing. Is there anyone else that you would like to see really engaged in the whole HIV/AIDS discussion?
I think we do need to acknowledge the extraordinary contribution of the US government to the global AIDS response, because I did say earlier that the World Bank had catalyzed the first $1 billion AIDS response, but then the US President's initiative increased that amount to $13 billion. And the latest Global Health Initiative increased that to $61 billion, primarily for AIDS. And that means the US government is essentially responsible for 56% of international global HIV financing. And I do think that needs to be acknowledged, and I do think we all need to work to share that burden. It's going to be a big challenge in future.
There's a lot of, you know, someone here actually, another online question has asked about working with local communities.
Yes.
and their contribution,
yes.
Because there is a lot of focus on what is the world doing, what's the World Bank doing, what's
sure.
the US government doing, but like you said, you have talked about things from a grassroots level. So could we talk more about that?
Sure. Well, actually, in fact, I think we're very proud that in our MAP programs, the multi-country AIDS programs, which reached approximately 30 African countries, we did our best to earmark at least 50% of the funds for community initiatives. And we financed several thousand community organizations all over Africa who provided prevention services to millions of people, provided orphan support services to hundreds of thousands of people, and we really think gave communities an opportunity to play a bigger role. And I think the evidence is clear. Community engagement is critical for prevention. It's critical to motivate people to seek treatment. It's critical to reinforce people's adherence to treatment, and it's critical to help us to reduce the impact of AIDS by, for example, community-based orphan care and support programs. So community responses are central.
And in the communities, is it local people? Is it community organisations? Who in the community is doing this work?
I think there are many different tiers. We have, for example, international NGOs who often serve as a conduit for international financing to countries, who often work with medium or large-sized national NGOs who then support community organizations. But the bulk of the service delivery is usually provided by grassroots, formal or informal community organizations.
Great. And could you give me give an example of a community-based initiative that has made a difference?
I think that some of the best examples are probably to have been found in Uganda, where very early on, before we had treatment for HIV, communities provided home-based care services to people who were affected with HIV. And that was very important because it led entire communities to openly acknowledge there are people with HIV living in their communities. It had a strong prevention benefit because communities really changed their norms in fundamental ways to make safer environments for young people, to discourage people from having multiple sexual partnerships. And I think what was striking about Uganda's early community response was the very close integration of both care for people who were sick and also prevention services. And we have thousands of similar initiatives in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa.
And is Uganda being used as a model by other countries, since it seems to have been very successful?
I think what we've learned most from Uganda is how important it is to have national political commitment, how important it is to have religious and traditional leaders' engagement and how important it is to have grassroots activism. But I think the thing that Uganda has also shown us, and this is more sobering, is the challenge of rejuvenating prevention. And I say this because HIV prevalence in many parts of Uganda fell from a peak of almost 30% to approximately 7% today. But it's been stable at 7% now for several years, and there are indications it's starting to grow again. We're seeing similar signs in Kenya and elsewhere in the region. So we really face this challenge in countries whose epidemics have plateaued. What do we do to rejuvenate, to revitalize prevention, and to further drive HIV rates down?
And have you got any thoughts on that at all?
I think that a part of it is understanding how our epidemics change over time. And one of the ways in which they change is as epidemics mature, an increasing number of infections occur between already infected spouses and their partners. And we do need better programs for couples where one partner is positive and the other is negative. We have some promising work. Susan Allen and her colleagues in Rwanda and in Zambia, but we do need to expand these programs.
And we've mentioned the word epidemic a lot of times. Could you actually give the definition for what an epidemic is?
An epidemic is essentially a disease where one infection leads to multiple other infections, so we get a strong growth or expansion in infections. Endemic essentially means that it's at stable or residual levels rather than rising levels.
And another online question we have is, do you think the worst impact of the financial crisis on HIV and AIDS programs is yet to come? You did point to this earlier.
Yes, I do. I think that there are several reasons for this, but I think it's remarkable when we look back on the first wave of the economic crisis, and I'm not an economist, I'm a public health person, but it is striking how Africa in particular and the South were not as affected as we thought. South Africa was probably the most affected country, but as you know, countries in West Africa continued to grow strongly throughout the crisis. And I think that may have obscured the extent of the crisis in the North. And what we've seen in the North is countries running huge deficits in order to try and extricate themselves from financial crisis. And getting out of the red is going to take a long, long time, and it's hard to see that it's not going to affect development assistance. So yes, I think we have to be very realistic about the likely impact on future development financing, including HIV financing.
And is there a way to stem that, or is there a way to compensate for it in some other way?
One of the ways is the famous Abuja Declaration, where every African head of state undertook to commit a specific amount of their GDP to health services, and only one country met that goal, that was Liberia. So I do think that in future, more diversified financing, including more national financing of AIDS programs and health programs, is going to be important.
And do you find that countries are really taking this on?
If I refer to the earlier Abuja statistic, I don't think with sufficient urgency. And as I said, because the real weight of the economic crisis wasn't felt in the South, I'm not sure if southern countries have an understanding of the depth and the severity of the financial crisis in the traditional donor communities.
So we have another question here from Facebook.
Yeah.
People with HIV in the US live longer as a result of highly active antiretroviral therapy,
Yes.
follow-up services and close monitoring. Has the World Bank used some of these success stories?
In fact, that's interesting, and here again I think we need to pay tribute to the US government, whose PEPFAR program really fundamentally changed access to treatment globally. But what has been striking is that treatment outcomes in Africa have been far better than expected, and in many cases as good as treatment outcomes in the West. And so we've shown that it's possible to deliver highly effective treatment in very resource-constrained environments. We've also shown in Africa that it's possible to simplify treatment regimens without compromising quality. So I think Africa can be very proud of what it's achieved in treatment in the last decade.
It seems that there are quite a number of success stories that could be replicated in Africa for the eradication of HIV and AIDS. Would you agree?
I would. I think we've already seen the replication. I referred to treatment expansion, for example. I do think when we talk about prevention, it is important to recognize that for reasons we don't fully understand, Africa's HIV epidemics are different to those elsewhere in the world. And we often distinguish between what we call concentrated epidemics, where HIV circulates among vulnerable groups, sex workers, drug users, men who have sex with men, and generalized epidemics, where HIV is spread primarily in the general population. And the only continent to experience generalized epidemics has been Africa. And that does mean that Africa does need to forge its own solutions to its own generalized epidemics.
Is that a function of size, or are there other causes?
I don't think we fully understand the reasons. We simply don't. There may be differences in the virulence of some strains of HIV in Africa, but the evidence for that isn't conclusive. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of other questions. Talking about young people and children, because we talked a bit about orphans.
Sure.
What's the impact, on children of this disease?
Well, I think it's important to remind ourselves that one of the reasons that HIV matters so very much to the World Bank as a development institution is it's really the only disease which targets adults, parents, breadwinners. Most other diseases have their most severe impact on childhood and on the very old. What HIV does is really tears the demographic heart out of a society by killing the most economically productive and often killing them in pairs. And I think we saw how severe that impact was on children before treatment became more widespread. And I mentioned that in Swaziland, for example, in many communities, up to 1 in 3 children have been orphaned by AIDS. And that's been a tremendous development impact.
And again, you did talk about, orphan services.
Yes.
Are there other things that, happen to look after children who are, who have been orphaned and who are themselves impacted with HIV? That's
right. And we have some suggestive studies now from Zimbabwe suggesting that orphans may themselves be more vulnerable to acquire HIV. So we may be seeing intergenerational vulnerability, and that just underscores the importance of tackling this problem. And I did mention that community-based organizations, churches in particular, had played an immense role in providing support to orphans. It's also important, though, to have functioning government safety nets. And countries such as South Africa, Botswana, Namibia have welfare grants. South Africa has the largest proportion of welfare grants of any developing country, and those welfare grants have almost certainly played a major role in helping to mitigate the impact of AIDS. What we've seen is that communities can care for orphans if they have access to financial resources, which in Southern Africa has been provided through national welfare systems.
So, talking about youth, what is your main message to youth on this World AIDS Day?
I think that my main message to youth is, despite the extraordinary promise of treatment, HIV really remains a serious, frightful and potentially deadly disease that as young people, today's youth, have the ability to make a difference. I think that in particular, trying to choose sexual partners from one's own age group is extremely important. The older our sexual partner, the more likely our sexual partner is to be very experienced and therefore more likely to have the virus. So trying to choose our partners our own age is pretty important.
Thank you for that. So I would recommend to the people viewing online to keep on sending in questions, and we can keep on putting them to David to answer. So just moving on to another topic is I'm not sure actually. I'm just going to have a quick think about that.
Sure, Lada.
Actually, what I am interested in, just from a personal perspective, is, as a public health person, what led you to get into this area? What do you find interesting about it? And would you encourage others to follow in your footsteps?
Well, from Zimbabwe. I worked for almost 20 years at the University of Zimbabwe. We had an exchange program with the University of Zambia in the mid to late 1980s, at the time when the first HIV cases were public in Zambia before Zimbabwe, and it was evident that this would be the dominant public health challenge of our times, and that's still the case. I think a challenge before us is to keep a focus on HIV while also trying to strengthen health systems and ensure that other diseases are not neglected. So I would certainly encourage people to enter this field, and I think that entering it through the lens of balancing HIV with other health and development challenges, and I think in particular entering it through the lens of health financing, how we better finance our health and AIDS programs in future, could be really important contributions. And of course we still critically need the local community participation at every tier in our societies.
Thank you. So we have a question from Bhutan, which applies also to Africa. Can you suggest what to do to help young people when the number of HIV/AIDS patients is growing?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have a question for Bhutan. I've been privileged to visit Bhutan. It's a very beautiful country. If the question applies specifically to Bhutan, then I think what's interesting about Bhutan is that a majority of its HIV cases appear to be associated with external transmission, with sexual exposure in India in particular. And I think the point it underscores is to know our epidemics and to know who is getting infected and how, because that varies so much. And what makes a young girl in Botswana vulnerable to HIV is so different to what makes a young girl in Bhutan vulnerable to HIV. So we really need to look at each context before answering it. But I think many of the points I've made earlier would apply in most contexts. I'd also point out that in Bhutan, pregnancy and other sexually transmitted infections may be at least as great a risk as HIV. So to consider our sexual lives in the context of all of the challenges that sexuality presents. But I think that exercising very good, careful judgment, being cautious, choosing partners very carefully, trying to choose partners from one's own age range, and of course using condoms and other contraceptive protective methods in Bhutan for not just HIV but for other reasons is important.
Thank you. So would you say that this is, from our conversation and from everything that I've heard, which is actually really fascinating for me, that this is just part of a much wider, the context here is much wider. We're talking about culture and norms and behaviour, and we're talking about, stigma and discrimination and gender and a whole range of things, financing, politics. And so the issue to be tackled is not just HIV, it's all of these things together.
That's an excellent summary. You asked me earlier what we'd learned, and I confined my answers to Africa, but if I were now to use the Bhutan opportunity and your question to expand our lens, I think what's striking about HIV globally is how extraordinarily diverse it is. It's spread in such different ways in different regions, but the common principle is one you've touched on, that HIV is able to seek out, find and exploit the fault lines in our societies, whatever they are, whether it's gender inequality, very high rates of alcohol use, income inequality, the history of apartheid in Southern Africa, whether it's very high rates of injecting drug use, for example, in the former Soviet Union, whether it's very high rates of sex work in parts of Asia. HIV exploits the fault lines that exist in our societies.
That's fascinating, and a call for all of us to really do something about what's happening in our societies.
Right.
So I just want to close with, what is the future direction for the World Bank?
I think that we would begin by saying that the World Bank is fundamentally committed to HIV as a long-term developmental challenge. The World Bank also responds to demand from countries, and I think in many countries we are seeing some complacency about the importance of AIDS and health investments, and I think it's important for societies to hold their governments accountable for providing health, AIDS, education and other services. And I think the stronger the national voices are for a focus on these services, the more likely it is that countries will seek the World Bank as a partner for these services, because we really do respond to the requests that governments bring to us. So it's important for citizens of countries to hold both their own countries and us accountable for responding to national priorities.
So basically the power of the people.
Yes.
So thank you so much, David, for your time. and for everybody for joining us for this discussion. And I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you, Lola, and thanks very much to people who wrote in. Thank you.
Thank you.